Shut up!
Welcome back to part 3 of why Meghan Markle failed as a royal. So in part 1, we talked about the American Duchess. In part 2, we discussed the parasite on a fish outsider foreigner Duchess. And today for part 3, we shall discuss the poor little commoner who lost her voice and couldn't cope because real life was apparently nothing like a Disney movie. All right, so we all know, and we have mentioned this in the 2 prior videos, that Meghan Markle has endlessly moaned and complained about never being shown the royal ways like they did in that Disney movie, The Princess Diaries, from literally over 20 years ago now.
There was no guidance as well. Unlike what you see in the movies, there's no class on how to be royal.
And at the time of the Oprah interview, we didn't have Tom Bower's Revenge yet. We didn't even have Valentine Lowe's Courtiers yet. But we now know that the late Queen, may she rest in peace, handpicked one of her longest serving and most loyal employees or aides at the palace, Samantha Cohen, to personally show Meghan the royal ropes, which despite basically handing in her notice to resign, she promptly tried to do, and keyword tried, creating a team of 14 experienced officials, which included familiar face to the channel, Jason Kanoff, and Lieutenant Colonel Nana Kofi Tuomasi Ankara, who is a very interesting character in and of himself, and we will be revisiting him in a little bit more detail in the next installment in this series, where we will be covering Meghan's whole biracial racism shtick. And they were all picked to teach Meghan basically everything she needed to know about royal life, starting off with 6 months of listening and learning, as the palace called it. Ironically, given what happened later with Ngozi Fulani or Marlene Headley, Lady Susan Hussey, the late Queen's lady-in-waiting since 1960, and one of her closest and most trusted friends, was also handpicked as part of this elite group. So not only was Meghan definitely assigned a team to show her the royal ways and teach her and guide her, she was given the creme de la creme of the bunch. And this creme de la creme personally visited her at Notcott to talk to her about her concerns, her priorities, her ambitions, to help resolve any problems that have arisen by then, and just about her role within the royal family in general. But Meghan was having none of it, insisting that the palace was trying to mold her into somebody that she's not and silence her by stealing her voice, just like the evil Ursula did to Ariel all those years ago. I mean, what year was The Little Mermaid released? I actually have no idea. Let me check. Oh wow, it's actually older than I am. Jeez. So is it really any wonder that despite all of her personality flaws, which, you know, we know she has a lot, she failed so dismally at being a royal when she absolutely refused to take any advice from literally anyone? It's like refusing to show up to class, you know, in school or university the entire year and then reporting the teacher and complaining, of course, when you inevitably end up failing. And this is supposedly the smart one.
I was the smart one.
As is usually the case with liars, they tend to forget their lies. And they also tend to fail to consider the consequences of said lies. In this instance, despite getting on Oprah and lying through her teeth about the lack of support, she had seemingly entirely forgotten, presumably because of baby brain, like she had once accused Catherine of suffering from, that she fed opposing information to her mouthpiece Omid Scobie to write his book Finding Freedom. And it wouldn't be the last time that she'd forgotten all about her collaboration with the man. Specifically, and in direct contradiction to her allegations on Oprah, Omid wrote, The Queen was wonderful, warm, and generous towards the new Duchess. She made sure Meghan knew what was going on, and Charles made sure Meghan was supported as she navigated the ups and downs of life in the public eye. Sounds like an awful lot of support from key players, nonetheless. So which is it? Did she perhaps lie to Omid and tell Oprah the truth? Or did she tell Omid the truth and lied on Oprah? Well, considering the information from both Revenge and Courtiers and the fact that it corroborates Omid's version, I mean, probably the first and last time it would ever happen, I think we can all safely conclude that it was the latter. And you know how they say that within some lies can be found a kernel of truth? Well, during the Oprah interview, Meghan doesn't outright deny that such assistance is available to new royal brides. She just said it wasn't offered to her specifically.
There's none of that training. That might exist for other members of the family. That was not something that was offered to me.
Which I can only assume she threw in there just to decorate her already elaborate lie about the non-existent racism that she allegedly faced. All I can say is no wonder she keeps slipping up and her story keeps changing, because what a tangled web she weaves. I said in the closing of part 2 that Meghan's apparent innate disgust at everything that makes her different, you know, the fact that she has a different nationality, a different background, a different ethnicity, heavily contributed to her failure to integrate into royalty. And of course, again, this is besides her obvious personality flaws. I mean, I think this innate disgust and this insecurity she has is inextricably linked to her personality issues. Now, in this instance in particular, she failed to recognize why people initially loved her so much. They saw her as a breath of fresh air and one of us, an aspect which she, in her unbridled desire to be above us all, utterly despised and tried her best to put as much distance between herself and the rest of us plebes, which ironically not only ended up making her extremely unlikable as a result, but it also made her seem like the least regal and dignified Duchess in modern times. She clearly has a blinding hatred for Catherine, so we couldn't have expected her to learn from her. She apparently refused Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh's help. But the thing is, even if she didn't despise Catherine, I really don't believe Meghan would have been able to learn from her anyway. Because you just can't learn how to be a good person when A, you aren't, and B, more importantly, you have zero interest in actually becoming one. Because Catherine is just inherently likable. She doesn't try to be likable like Meghan does with her I'm a hugger act and her fake smiles and sickly sweet voice. We can all see through that, and it only makes us dislike her even more. But more importantly, Catherine never tried to shy away from her commoner origins. I was going to say humble beginnings, but you know, her family's quite well off. She never pretended to be holier than thou. And it is exactly that common touch, that down-to-earth quality and genuineness and honesty that makes her so likable and yet so regal at the same time. It's a very delicate mix that I don't think can be faked. And so, in that aspect, Meghan was already at a disadvantage, again, because of her personality. But it is a pity that Meghan clearly has no interest in history, because she really could have, firstly, understood how privileged she is in comparison to the other women who were once in her position, and B, she could have learned how to best navigate this transition from commoner to royalty simply by studying the experiences of those who came before her. I briefly mentioned in part 2 the quite antiquated concept of morganatic marriages. Just to recap, these were basically marriages between royal men and commoner women in which the women, along with any children that they may have, were denied a title and the position and the privileges that the royal husbands enjoyed, which also entailed the children being excluded from the line of succession despite being legitimate. It was basically used as some kind of penalty for the royal in question's choice to even marry a commoner in the first place. And it's basically only a step up from being forced to abdicate if they're a monarch or otherwise renounce their succession rights to the throne, which did frequently happen. There was at least one notable exception, being Karin Mansdotter, the morganatic wife of King Eric XIV of Sweden, who did become Queen Consort of Sweden in 1568 until her husband was deposed a year later. Interestingly, it was Karin's humble origins as a peasant, as well as her good nature, that endeared her to the common folk. So much so that her estate was spared from being plundered by rebels during the Great Peasant Rebellion of 1596 to 97, which took place in Finland, where Karin lived for the rest of her life after her husband's death in 1577. So here we see a very early example of, I suppose, the power of the common touch. But apart from failing to grasp the importance of this concept, Meghan also failed to understand her truly privileged position within the British royal family, especially when compared to those who came before her, including Catherine. Rather than leave her to fend for herself for the most part, as they did with Queen Camilla and even Catherine before they were both married, the palace did everything in its power to not only protect Meghan, but to make her happy, going as far as extending her invitations and opportunities that have never been before extended to a girlfriend or fiancé. But rather than acknowledge and be grateful for this unprecedented show of acceptance and inclusion, she rages on about how she was not protected and thrown to the wolves. Well, perhaps someone needs to build her a time machine or sit her down and give her a long lesson on what true rejection and classism looks like. Almost every member of the Morganatic Wives Club, as I call it, experienced some form of classism, ranging from mild to the most severe, with the women frequently getting rejected and ridiculed by not just their royal in-laws, but by the government and the nobility as a whole. A notable example of this was Louise Rasmussen, Countess of Danner, or Countess Danner. A former ballet dancer and an illegitimate child, she was first the mistress of the then Crown Prince Frederick of Denmark before becoming his morganatic wife in 1850, 2 years after his ascension to the throne. And this 2-year delay was caused because the government initially forbade the union, citing the fact that the king was childless, and as is the case with morganatic marriages, any children he would have with Louise would automatically be excluded from the line of succession. Despite the king's obvious and lifelong affection for his wife, the marriage was met with much disdain by the nobility, who rejected the commoner-born Louise despite her position as countess, thereby making her a political liability for the king. How's that for being rejected? Eh, Meghan? This whole story actually really reminds me of Wallis Simpson and the then King Edward VIII, who apparently had proposed a morganatic marriage where he would continue to reign as king without Wallis inheriting any title of royalty, but the British government rejected that proposal. And so he went that step lower that I mentioned earlier and abdicated, renounced his rights. Now this name, I actually watched a few videos to learn how to pronounce it, and I know I'm still going to mess it up, but I promise you I tried and I practiced. Anna Plyokhin. Plyokhin? Plyokhin? I can't. Anna Plyokhin. 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 Oh my god.
Lucas Plyokhin.
Plyokhin. Anna Plyokhin. I'm not going to say that again. I'm going to keep calling her Anna. But Anna was the morganatic wife of Archduke John of Austria, who couldn't even marry John for 11 years because permission was initially denied. And even after she was married and titled as a countess, the disparity in their social ranks caused them a great deal of strife in high society, leading to a family rift that was so bad the couple were denied entry to the royal court. However, Anna, unlike Meghan, was actually quite likable. And she had that common touch, eventually earning her respect within the royal set, and she actually ended up being quite popular. eventually getting recognized as one of the queens of Austria's exclusive society. So despite all the wrongs, despite all the unfairness, the injustice that Anna faced, she persevered. She was like, you know what? Maybe the nobility don't want me. Doesn't mean I'm gonna start being all nasty. And the people loved her for it. Even the royals, even the upper class, eventually caved in. And over in 19th century Italy, we also see the magic of the common touch yet again. That silver lining in these otherwise dark and heavy clouds of classism. Rosa Vercellana, later Countess of Mirafiori and Fontanafredda, upon her marriage to Victor Emmanuel II, King of Italy, was also very well loved by the people for her commoner background, despite, you guessed it, being absolutely loathed by the nobility. And if you want to talk about a serious case of such hateful and needless rejection, get this. Upon Rosa's death in 1885, the Italian royal family refused to allow her to be buried with her husband at the Pantheon in Rome. So her children had a mini replica of the Pantheon called the Mausoleo della Bella Rossine to bury her there instead, only to have the mausoleum ransacked by grave robbers in 1970, prompting the removal of Rosa's remains to the Cimitero Monumentale di Torino, meaning she was never actually buried next to her beloved husband, ever. And tell me again how you were so cruelly rejected and ridiculed, Meghan? I think I've made my point. Here's the deal. To me, it is so clear that Meghan made a huge mistake by vastly underestimating the power of the common touch. Whereas most of these women that we discussed today actually benefited in some way, at least reputationally, from what was perceived as an unforgivable flaw by royalty and the nobility, and a boon by the common folk, which make up the majority. Meghan really could have had it all. She was not only loved by her in-laws and was absolutely not rejected or snubbed by the aristocracy or the, high society of England in general, but she was loved by the people. So she literally had the support and love of both before the monster within her reared its ugly head, thereby killing off all the love and support that she demanded and continues to demand from all of us. Meghan didn't need classism to be rejected and ridiculed. She heaped it all upon herself with her diabolical mixture of narcissism and victimhood. Because this mentality of I am a goddess and the entire world is out to get me has always been her Achilles heel and is what ultimately led to her fall from grace, making her the 40-year-old mermaid that we all laugh at today. If that isn't a cautionary tale, then I don't know what is.